of you guys on your way to church this morning stopped by your favorite coffee place? How many of you stopped by a Starbucks, or maybe it was a Tim Hortons, or maybe it was Brewed Awakening? Anybody do that this morning? Come on, I know there was a few of you that did that. Come on, raise your hands. Okay, only a few that are going to actually admit that. Some of you I know left in between the men's class and church this morning to go in to get your coffee, and they made sure they told me they were coming back. We all have these morning rituals, don't we? For some of us, it's going to a coffee shop to make sure we get that coffee or that tea that will get us through the morning or that will pick us up from where we started in the morning. A few weeks ago, I drove my kids to school, and I decided on my way after dropping them off that I would stop by Starbucks down at the Southland Mall and pick something up on my way into the office. So I parked at Chapters there, walked into the Starbucks, and placed my order. Now, you got to know about me is I'm not the most pleasant person in the morning. I'm not really a great morning person. For me, don't talk to me until after 9 o'clock in the morning. And this was even before 8 o'clock, so you know it's really, really bad. And so I went in, I got my coffee, I placed my order, and I moved along very efficiently to that waiting space where you wait for them to make that drink. And while I was standing there, I saw this lady come in. And she was bubbly, and she started to talk with the barista who was taking the order. She started to talk with the barista that was making her order. And she got her drink actually ahead of me. Yeah, I know, eh? And she left. And as she left, she said bye, and everybody seemed happy. And she seemed like she had a different experience than what I had in that Starbucks. You know, we both ordered from the same barista. We still got our drink from the same barista. We ordered a similar drink. And yet her experience was completely different. It seemed like she belonged there, whereas I just kind of stood there awkwardly in the corner waiting for my drink. Have you ever experienced something like that? Have you ever been somewhere and it feels like you're the odd person out, like you just don't belong there and everybody else seems to belong? Maybe that feels like you this morning. Maybe you're wearing a BC Lions jersey in Rydertown and you're not sure. We all have probably experienced this at one time or another. Maybe you've experienced this at that Starbucks that I went to. There's a study out of the University of British Columbia that kind of speaks to what went on there. And your favorite coffee shop, ordering your drink and then moving along, eye contact with, who engages in some sort of trivial and get to the office in a better mood than the person who efficiently went through the system. And this study concluded that what happens in that moment is that there is a deep sense of longing that is met inside of you. No way happier than the person who their order and leave. Inside all of us belong. You belong. Where do you belong? The Starbucks there, is that where you feel a sense of belonging, where that need is met? Because we all have this. We all feel this. A guy by the name of Maslow, back in 1943, he wrote a paper where he described a hierarchy of needs that we all share. 5 needs, and smack in the middle of this pyramid that he did is this need for belonging and love. And he says that, you know, this physiological, this is our need for like shelter and for food. For safety is to find that we're in a safe place where we're not going to be criticized. And then belonging and love. And if we don't get that belonging need met within us, then we don't become all that we can be. What he calls self-actualization there, what I'll call becoming what Jesus envisions. We were created to be someone. We were created as God's masterpiece, as you heard Kelly talk about at the beginning. And if we cannot have this need for belonging met inside of us, then we will never become what Jesus envisions. And this morning, I want to talk about that. Because we're all born with this from birth. Dr. Henry Cloud describes it kind of like a cell phone. Have any of you traveled and you land on the ground, and what's the first thing you do, right? You pull out that cell phone and you turn it on. Some of us do it even before we land to see if it actually will crash the plane or not, right? We turn on that cell phone when we land, And that cell phone starts searching for a connection to the nearest cell phone tower. And it says searching across the top. And Dr. Henry Cloud says that we are a lot like that when we are born. That we just start searching for this. And we go through our life like a cell phone, searching for the best connection in our life. And some of us spend a lot of energy on this. Have you ever traveled somewhere where you don't get good cell phone reception? My oldest daughter, used to live in this little hamlet in Alberta. And my cell phone company just didn't have reception there. As soon as I went down the hill into this one little area, I lost it all. And my phone would say searching and searching for as long as we were in that place. And you know what? My battery would drain way faster than it would when I was in the city. And we're a lot like that. We spend exorbitant amounts of energy trying to connect with someone, with trying to belong. And it wears us out. So how can we find and how can we have this need of belonging met today? Well, this is what we're going to talk about. And we're going to look at the book Ephesians as we do this. For the last couple of weeks, we have been looking at the book of Ephesians and exploring the idea of who we really are. And in week 1, we discovered this amazing truth that you are chosen. You are chosen as a child of God, with all of the blessings of the heavenly realms, Paul writes. With all the blessings of the heavenly realms that come from being a child of God. And then in week 2, we discovered that we are not defined by the things we did in the past, but we are defined by what Christ has done for us. That this is the defining characteristic of who we are. And now today we're going to look at this belonging, and we're going to look at Ephesians chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 19 to 22. And these 4 verses are kind of summary verses for everything that Paul has written in chapter 2. There's summary verses for what you heard Jethro read. And there's summary verses for even what we talked about last week. And so I'm going to jump around a little bit into the verses before, but we're going to anchor ourselves in verses 19 to 22. Follow along as I begin reading at verse 19. So now you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners. Strangers and foreigners. Paul describes the Gentiles as not being strangers and foreigners before. And you know, that's what the Jews, who Paul is writing to people in the church in the region of Ephesus, and there were 2 cultures in this region. There was the Jew and the Gentile. And the Jews viewed the Gentiles as strangers and foreigners. In fact, a little bit earlier in the chapter, Paul says this. He says, this is how the Jews described them. He said, you were called uncircumcised heathen. A literal translation is called the uncircumcised. This was a racial slur. This was not something that they wanted to be called. And Paul says, you used to be called this, the uncircumcised, by Jews who were proud of their circumcision. In the Old Testament, God tells the story about how Israel came to be, how the Jewish nation came to be. And one of the key defining moments in their story was when God said, I want you to use circumcision as a mark to say who is and who isn't part of the Jewish nation, who is and isn't part of Israel. And over the years, Israel developed an elitism, a superiority complex, because in that moment, God chose them to be his holy people. And he chose them to have a relationship that was unique amongst all the other nations. And over hundreds of years, this developed into this elitism, this superiority, so much so that they looked on the people around them and they said, they're just uncircumcised heathen. And they used racial slurs to describe them. They called them foreigners and strangers, even though they may have lived next to them for years. And the Gentiles weren't any better. The Gentiles referred to Jews by racial slurs as well. The Gentiles discriminated against the Jews as well. In the region of Ephesus, which would have been predominantly Gentiles, there would have been Jews in that area, but they would have looked down on them and not like them anymore. And so Paul is writing to a church in the region of Ephesus that is deeply divided along racial grounds, around religious grounds. Sounds a lot like today, doesn't it? This region called Ephesus is deeply divided, but our world is deeply divided as well. Around race, around color, around creed, around gender, around lifestyle. And there's something just as important for us to learn from this writing that Paul says to the Ephesians as there is for us today. In fact, the church in the region of Ephesus was just as divided as the culture that they lived in. And Paul is repeatedly having to say to not just the church in Ephesus, but to other churches, that this is not how God intended things to be. This isn't God's plan for you. Paul says, you were foreigners and strangers. And in verse 12, he says, in those days you were living apart from Christ. You were excluded from citizenship among the people of Israel, and you did not know the covenant promises God had made to them. You lived in a world without God and without hope. And the language that Paul is writing as he writes to both Jew and Gentile refers back to something that was established in the Old Testament. And it uses language that harkens back to the way God established the Israel people. You see, at first, the Israelites, they lived in tents. And even God's temple was actually a tent called the tabernacle. And there were instructions to put the tabernacle in the center of the camp. And then all of the Jews would be living around that, and on the outside were all the foreigners, the expats from other countries coming and living amongst them. They weren't allowed close to the tabernacle. They lived around on the outside the camp. They were foreigners and they were strangers. They weren't considered citizens the same as a Jew was. But now Paul writes something different. He says, so now you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners. You are citizens along with all of God's holy people. He says everything has changed. You see, you used to be alone. Paul says that in verses 11 to 13. He says you used to be far from God. You used to live outside the camp. You used to be called racial slurs because you used to be alone. You used to try and find a place to belong, a place that you could call home, a place that would meet this need that's inside of you. You were alone, but not anymore, because now you are citizens. He says you are citizens along with God's holy people. And you gotta know that as this was being read out, kind of like in a setting like this, that all the Gentiles all of a sudden perked up. What do you mean we're not the uncircumcised anymore? And you gotta know that when the person who was reading this said, along with all of God's holy people, that all the Jews in the room paid attention as well. Because all of a sudden, everything has changed. Wait a minute, what do you mean we're no longer this? What do you mean they're no longer that? You are members of God's family, Paul says. And Paul talks a little bit early on. He says that Christ himself, in verse 14, has brought peace to us. He has united Jews and Gentiles into one people. When his body on the cross, he broke down the wall of hostility. He united everyone as one people. Paul doesn't say, now you Gentiles, you're going to become Jews. And he doesn't say to the Jews, now you're going to become Gentiles. He says, no. All of your cultures, all of your uniqueness, all of the diversity that is within this church, when you are united with Christ through what he has done, through his saving work, his atoning sacrifice, that you are united as a new people. Nothing like what it has been before. And he goes on in that verse and he talks about Christ through his body on the cross breaking down the wall of hostility, which really doesn't mean much to us today. But to a Jew and a Gentile, especially if they were religious, they would have understood what this meant. This word wall can be fence or railing. But as we look in the first century to how this Greek word actually translates, we see that it is most often used within a religious context, and it is most often associated with the temple. And you see within the temple in Jerusalem, there was this court called the Court of the Gentiles. And there was a wall, a barrier that prevented the Gentiles from going beyond that point into the rest of the temple. And there was actually a sign on that wall that said if a Gentile went past this point, that they would be killed. And actually in Acts chapter 21, we read that Paul is grabbed when he's visiting Jerusalem, And people want to kill him. Why? What's the accusation? The accusation being made is that he took a Gentile past that barrier into the rest of the temple. This is how serious this was. And there was this wall of hostility that said, if you go past this, you will be killed. And Paul says that Christ, through his work on the cross, has torn down that wall. It's no longer there. He removes the barrier to belonging. That now you are united as one people. But let's take this a step further. You see, in Luke 23:45, it says that when Jesus died on the cross, that at the moment that he died, that there was a curtain in the temple that was torn from the ceiling to the floor, meaning that no human did it, that God tore that curtain. And that curtain was around a place called the Holy of Holies. And you see, there was a place in the temple where even a normal Jew couldn't go. Only the high priest could go into this place. And at the moment that Jesus died, the curtain to the Holy of Holies, which was where it was believed that God's presence resided, at the moment that Christ died, that curtain was torn, meaning that we can have access to the very presence of God. So that barrier between us and God was removed. But then Paul says, no, that's not it. That the barrier between you and me, the barrier, the wall of hostility, is also removed. This is what Jesus did on the cross, is he united us in a way that can never be done through any other means. That when we are united with Christ, we are united with God the Father and with each other. And this is incredibly important for us because we see a world that is deeply divided on every front. And we see a world that is struggling very hard to bring unity to people who are divided. And friends, not another commission, not another mark. The only thing that will bring people together is Christ. He is the solutions in the world, all of the financial divisions in the world. You name a division in this world, the division over gender, the division over religion. It is only through unity with Jesus Christ, as we unite our life with him, that we will find that there is unity between each other. This is what Paul is talking about and how it applies to us today. Because when we come to Christ, when we are united with him, we become citizens, members of God's own family. And this changes everything because you used to be alone, but now you have a place to belong. And that belonging that we are searching to meet, that belonging that we are searching to have, that need that we all carry, is not going to be found in another Starbucks. The belonging is not going to be found in another relationship. The belonging is not going to be found at Mosaic Stadium. The belonging is not going to be found wherever you're currently searching. It is only going to be found as you unite your life with Jesus Christ. And then he makes it possible for us to connect and to belong to each other. Let's keep reading. Together, we are his house, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Together, we are his house. Well, this is incredibly important for us today because we have this idea in our world that individualism is the most important thing. That it's me and God and my Bible and I need nobody else. The mantra of our day is to whatever feels good, do it. To your own self be true. And it's even true within our own church that we have this idea that individualism is the most important thing, that my relationship with God is the most important thing, and I don't need the rest of the church in order to actually grow in my faith. That I can come here, and studies are showing that church attendance in Canada is 1 in 3. 1 out of every 3 weeks. And what are we saying in that moment? We are saying, I don't need the church in order to grow in my faith. But Paul actually says, together we are his house, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. And the cornerstone is Christ himself. Together together. There is something that Paul wants to teach us about how we need to come together, not as individuals, but as a corporate unit. That there is something for Christ, that there is something for us to experience of the presence of God when we gather together. The idea that he has here, the image that he's putting forward, is that of a construction site, that we are being built into a house. It's a work in progress. So he says to the church in Ephesians that is, in Ephesus, that is deeply divided, he says, you're a work in progress. But as you come together, you are being formed into the house of God. And he says the same thing to us as Living Hope today. Sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. But together, we are coming together to form the presence of God here in Regina. And we are being built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. And the cornerstone is Christ himself. The cornerstone. In our day, cornerstones aren't that important. They're just kind of decorative stones that we carve something on that says, here's when this was built, or here's the important people that were here when something was built. But in Jesus' day, in Paul's day, cornerstones were actually more important than the foundation. In Regina, the foundation's pretty important, right? Paul says, no, the cornerstone is the most important thing. Why is this? It's because the cornerstone was this massive block, and everything in that structure was aligned with the cornerstone. Everything was measured based on where the cornerstone was put. And we are being built into something unique here at Living Hope. And as we align ourselves with Jesus, he unites us into a new people, and he makes us something unique. And the point of all this is that we need to continually be aligning ourselves with Christ. That as we look at the cross, we need to say, is my life reflective of Jesus? I need to look at all of you through the cross. Because if I'm not looking at you through the cross, then what happens is I start to get these ideas about who you might be and who I might be. And just like the Jews and the Gentiles in Ephesus in that day, I can start to think of myself as better than the next person. But when I begin to look at the cross and I see you, I start to realize that we aren't any different. That no matter where you're from or how you were raised, that both of us need Jesus Christ. And in every situation as we go through our week, we need to look at the people around us, whether they are far from God or whether they are near to God. We need to look through the cross of Jesus Christ at the people around us. Envision them gathering around the cross, and all we can see is each other through the cross. Because as we do, we will begin to align ourselves around what Jesus says about us and about them. And we will start to become this people that are united in a new way, with a new purpose, with incredible amounts of belonging. Paul goes on, and he says this, we are carefully joined together in him, becoming a holy temple for the Lord. He continues this emphasis on a kind of a construction site. And this idea of carefully joined together is something that is describing the way bricks are put together. Have you ever built a brick wall? A number of years ago, I got to help build a brick wall, meaning that I carried the bricks while the other person put it together. But as I carried the bricks, I got to watch the bricklayer as he put this wall together. And I watched him select every brick carefully. And I watched him some of the bricks had some deformities on them, and so he cleaned them up. Some of the bricks had to be kind of trimmed down because they weren't quite the right size for where they needed to go in the wall, but he chose every brick specially. And he laid them out one by one on the ground. And he made sure that they were perfectly the right width altogether, that they each fit right into that wall. And then he began to take the mortar. And he began to put mortar on them and stick them carefully together. And once that mortar dried, it was a solid wall. And he had to make sure as he was laying each brick that they were all aligned properly. In fact, one day I remember coming back and finding out that one of the bricks wasn't quite right in the wall. And so I was handed a hammer, and I was told to break down that wall because it had to be fixed. And there was no way to get that one brick out besides doing damage to the whole wall and having to rebuild it. And Paul says that we are carefully joined together. That Christ, as he is building his church, has specifically chosen you to be a part of what he is building. That together we form the house of God. And you have been chosen for a specific place in what he is doing. And I have been chosen for a specific place in what he is doing. And the person next to you has been chosen for a specific place in what he is doing. And we have been joined together as surely as bricks in a wall are mortared and joined together. Do you understand the implications of what Paul is saying here? It says that you are here this morning for a purpose. That you just aren't here by happenstance. That you didn't just luck upon this place. That God actually chose for you to be a part of this church. Because remember, Paul is writing this to the church in Ephesus. And he is saying to them, you, Ephesus, you have been carefully joined together into what Christ is building, his church. And if you remember from week 1, I said that this letter to the Ephesians was written as kind of an open letter. That it was for many people beyond just the church in Ephesus. The whole region was meant to read this letter and insert their church's name in there. So it is appropriate for us to say that you have been chosen and you are carefully joined together to form the church which is living hope. Because you belong here. You were alone. But then Christ died so that you would have a place to belong. And you belong here at Living Hope. And there is a unique purpose for you here with us together. And there is a unique purpose for me to be here with you. Because we belong here. So why do we belong here? Well, Paul goes on and he says this. We are carefully joined together in him, becoming a holy temple for the Lord. Through him, you Gentiles are also being made part of this dwelling where God lives by his Spirit. The temple was the place that represented God with his people. When God allowed Solomon hundreds of years before to build the temple, it was like God was saying, I'm moving into the neighborhood. I'm going to be your neighbor. You're going to know where you can find me. I'm going to take up shop. I'm going to take up residence right near you guys. And Paul says now we are being formed together, each one of us, into the temple of God. That together we form God's presence on earth, the dwelling place where he is. Again, do you see the implications of this? This means that when we are apart, that we're missing something. If we go back to our individualism, we say, me, God, the Bible, I don't need anything else. And we know that the Spirit is inside us because Paul talks about it. He says that the Spirit was put inside us when we united our life with Christ. That was the seal, that was the deposit. And so we think, I'm good, I don't need anybody else. But Paul says, no. Together we are being formed. Together we are being joined together. And together we are the temple of God, the presence of God in Regina, in Southeast Regina. That together we need each other in order to experience the fullness of God, to experience all that he has for us. Because by myself, I have a seal, I have a deposit, but it's not the whole thing. And we need each other. I need you to reveal God to me, and you need me to reveal God to you. Together we are his temple. And when we check out, when we leave, when we make it feel like someone doesn't belong, we lose out on the presence of God that is in them and what he has to reveal to us through them in our community. We are part of the dwelling where God lives by his Spirit. So what do we do about this? Well, you belong here. And you are part of God's plan for Living Hope, for Regina. So how do we respond? Well, my question is, where do you belong? There's two questions I want to ask you today. The first is, are you choosing to belong? You see, we're all searching for this need to be met, this need for belonging. And the fact is that Jesus removes all the barriers to belonging. But we keep throwing up barriers to belonging. Maybe it's out of fear. Maybe it's because we think better of ourselves than we should. The fact is that Jesus has moved the barriers, and if we would unite ourselves, if we would align ourselves with him, that those barriers are gone. But often we choose not to belong. Are you choosing to belong? Maybe you've made a choice not to be united with Christ. And so maybe today your response to this, to what you've heard, is to actually say, you know what, I need to align myself with Christ. I need to see people through the cross. I need to accept Christ's work on the cross. And I need to choose to find my belonging in him instead of where you've been finding it. Or maybe you've been coming all the time and you've been holding back, not engaging with the rest of this community. Friends, together we experience the fullness of God's presence in our community. And so when I'm holding back, when you're holding back, we are losing out. What if you chose to engage? What if you joined a group? Come to our midweek service. You can join a group and just see what it's like, see what that community is like, and grow together in your faith. Maybe you're holding back and it's time to actually choose to belong. Or maybe, here's the second question, what are you doing to help others belong? Are you helping the person next to you belong? You see, sometimes we choose not to engage. We say, I'm going to hold back until someone actually talks to me, until someone invites me. And you know what? If we're all holding back and we're all waiting for somebody else to make the first move, nobody's making the first move, right? It's kind of like coming to a four-way stop. Anybody ever do that? You come to a four-way stop and there's like 3 other cars or 4 other cars at the same time and you're just sitting there, right? Or if you're me, it's like, come on! Right? And somebody has to take that first move. Are you helping others belong? Are you helping others find the belonging that you want yourself? You know, if every single one of us just helped one other person in this room or that comes through this door to belong, all of us would have that need met. Do for one what you wish you could do for them all. Do for one what you wish would be done for you. And pretty soon, belonging will be found in relationship between us. Maybe you need to get involved in serving. Maybe become a greeter, an usher, who are focused on helping people feel like they belong every Sunday morning. Maybe become a kids worker or a youth worker and help them find belonging in their environments that are specially crafted for them. Are you helping others belong? Or maybe, in both of these questions, as you look at it, maybe it's time to become a member. Sometimes we hang back from the church. We say, well, I'm committed, I'm doing this, but we don't become a real member of the church. And membership is about saying, you know what, I belong here. And it's the church saying back to you, you belong here. It is this commitment that we make to each other that says we're going to do everything we can to make each other feel like we belong. And maybe today you've been hanging back for years. And maybe today is the day that you say, you know what, I'm going to do that. I'm going to say that I belong. I'm going to choose to belong. I'm going to help others belong. How can you make a difference here? Jesus had this vision for his people. And Paul is describing it here. This vision for his people was that we would be incredibly diverse, radically inclusive, and that through our uniqueness, through our diversity, that all of us would experience the fullness of the presence of God together. Because we belong here with each other. And we are part of God's plan for each other's lives. Imagine what it might be like if all of us chose to actually belong. If all of us choose to believe that Jesus, when we are united with him, that he removes all the barriers to belonging. And if we leaned in on our relationships, imagine what might happen. And that's where I'm going to leave you this week. Because next week we're going to pick it up right there. And we're going to talk about what happens when we become this incredibly diverse, radically inclusive community of unique people who reveal the glory of God everywhere, including to each other. I want to invite the worship team to come back up. And as they're coming, I'd invite you to think about, are you choosing to belong, and are you helping those around you to belong?